He has been called one of the nation's brightest and most energetic defenders of civil rights issues, and one of the most powerful members of Congress due to his ability to build bridges across party lines. Not without his detractors or scandals, he has nonetheless won every one of his re-election campaigns since 1983 by wide margins. In 2007, he became the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, which put him right in the center of the U.S. financial crisis. Hello, I'm Ernie Manouse. Coming up on InnerVIEWS, our conversation with the 15-term congressman from Massachusetts, Barney Frank. Is there still honor in being an elected official?
Oh, I think so. I think people have this varying approach, I think. There's a great deal of criticism of elected officials in general, but in the individual case, people are really very generous and gracious. That's the norm that you serve in a legislature you come to expect. The legislative bodies are always unpopular, but people like their own individual legislator. And I think people still are very gracious, and certainly objectively, I think there's great honor. I can't think of anything that's more of an honor and carries a greater sense of responsibility and some gratification that the people among whom you live say, look, you go there and you represent me and you decide what the level of taxation is and what we're going to do to clean up the atmosphere and what the level of medical care will be when I'm old and whether or not we go to war. People are entrusting you with these enormously important decisions.
How do you evaluate yourself, I guess, is the question.
Oh, I don't. I think there's no sensible way for a politician to evaluate yourself. Either you come across as arrogant or not credibly humble. So I think it's best to leave that to others.
Yeah. Do you know, though, then how you figure out if you're doing the best job you can be doing? What do you do for yourself?
Well, you do several things. First of all, you have your own inner compass. Secondly, you get results. Now, you don't always get results because that doesn't mean there aren't results. It means that you don't get them. That is, much of what we do is one factor among many factors. It's sometimes very hard to be sure. And that's why some political debates go on and on and on. We're doing an economic recovery program as you and I speak. It's going to, I think, have a positive effect. But it'll be impossible to argue. Let me take the bill we passed last fall when the Secretary of the Treasury and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve and the Bush administration said, if you don't give us the authority to spend $700 billion, the economy will have a serious collapse. Now, we gave them the authority to spend half of it and then come back and we would pass judgment. And we, in fact, said they didn't do it well enough, so we withheld it for Obama for the second half. But I think it is the case that the $350 billion that they used kept things from getting worse. I think it could have been even better because they failed to do some things they should have done. But it's not an easy argument to make to the voters, namely, look, I know things are awful, but they would have been worse if I hadn't intervened. People don't want to hear that. They want to hear that you help make things better. But you do have sometimes results. Then I have a group of people whose opinions I value, some of whom work for me and some who don't. I think anybody in a position of responsibility needs to have both people that you work with, in my case, people who are under my supervision, who have independence. I've told them, if people forget to tell me good news, that's no problem. If they forget to give me bad news, if they forget to tell me that I did something I shouldn't have done or that things have gone wrong, then I'll be unhappy. I really need that input to be corrected. And maybe most important of all, I represent in the Congress 650,000 people. And I am constantly hearing from them by mail, by telephone, when I'm in my district. I go to some structured events, but I'll also be sitting in a restaurant or walking around, and that's another very important set of results that you get.
Often a question that I ask elected officials is how much do you follow your own conscience and belief, and how much do you do the will of the people? And what are they electing you to actually do?
I believe that we should do what we think is correct. Now, the people's opinion is very important. It is a form of input. It varies. There are some moral issues, right and wrong, where I think you should do what you think is right and wrong. Remember, it's easier for me. I have a 2-year term. I run for office every 2 years. I've been running for office every 2 years in Congress since 1980. People can fairly easily get rid of me if they don't like me. And people say, oh, you can't defeat an incumbent. Well, in the last few years, large numbers of incumbents have been defeated. If incumbents don't get defeated, it's more because people are approving of what they do. I do ask people constantly to tell me what they think, and in some cases, their opinion is the relevant data. That is, you're trying to figure out, is this the right thing or the wrong thing? Does this highway need fixing, or do we need more police? Well, how the public reacts is a part of it. But in the end, I think what you owe people is your best judgment. Ever since I first ran for office, for the state legislature and also for Congress, I've been very explicit about what I believe in. I tell people when I run what my views are. Frankly, I sometimes think I'm ready to tell them more than they want to hear. And then I try to carry that out. The other point is this. If I wanted to do whatever the public wanted, I don't know how I would find that out. Again, I have 270, 300,000 people vote in the elections when I run. I don't know how you would find it out. I suppose you could poll. I don't think people want me to poll on every issue. Amendments come up. Plus, there's debate. There are hearings. I mean, people, I think, vote for me because they are in general agreement with my approach and trust my judgment to figure out, given the values that I share with them, with the majority, how it works. I had a long conversation. I was in my office last week, and a woman called. She was surprised that I answered the phone. People sometimes do that. They call, I answer the phone. They said, oh, I didn't think you would answer the phone. I said, well, then it was ringing. I mean, isn't that the normal reaction to a ringing phone? And she was disappointed. She was obviously a fairly conservative Republican who hadn't voted for me, as was her right. And she was disappointed because I would not agree with her to vote against the economic recovery plan. My answer is, well, in the first place, my impression is that the great majority in my district agreed with the plan. I had said I liked these sorts of things when I ran, and I thought she was being unreasonable. I said, well, you have to listen to me. I'm the voter. Well, but there are hundreds of thousands of voters. So I think in the end, you should be explicit about what you think is right. To the extent that you know a specific issue is coming up, you ought to tell people. You take your values there, you listen, you debate, and in the end, you do what you think best. Look, there's another aspect of it. We live in a large country with a large legislative body. You have to put priorities in what you want. There are issues where there may be 4 or 5 issues that the people in my district agree with. And a couple may be important than the other. And it may be that to accomplish the ones that are the most important, I have to trade off on the lesser ones. I have to expect that people will give me the trust to do that. But you do that. You hire someone to work for you. You hire a doctor. You hire a lawyer. They make trade-offs. Mm-hmm. They will trade off in trying to do the best for you possible. Ideally, people have enough confidence in you for you to do that. When they lose the confidence, out you go every 2 years.
Take me back then. When did the political bug first bite you?
I was in high school in Bayonne, New Jersey, where I grew up. And, I take it back. I was not quite in high school. My father, who since passed away, was what we now call an early adopter. He was into the latest in technology. That's one trait I did not inherit. And he bought a television set the day I was born, which was in 1940. People didn't know we had television sets. And we had television sets, just didn't have many programs. And so I remember watching the Kefauver hearings on crime in 1950. I was 10 years old. I didn't fully understand them, but something about them that fascinated me. He was investigating the mafia. Then came the Army McCarthy hearings in 1954. And also in 1954, I was 14, and a 14-year-old, I read in the newspaper, had been murdered in Mississippi. A young black guy, Negro was the phrase then, a 14-year-old, exactly my age. He'd been visiting relatives in Mississippi from Chicago. They thought he had either whistled at or looked inappropriately at a white woman, never touched her, never said anything, and he was found, his body was found drowned. And the law enforcement people probably had something to do with it, certainly didn't help. His name was Emmett Till. And I was outraged. I said, wait, how could this happen in America? How could the cops kill a young black guy my age just for, looking inappropriately? And I found I just had this great desire to try and change things. And what I found, and I was lucky, I found something that I thought was morally valuable, trying to I mean, my general sense is my role is to try and make the world more fair, less unfair. You can't make it totally fair. That is, there shouldn't be hungry children. People shouldn't be discriminated against based on their race. People shouldn't be victimized by things outside of their control. The flip side of that is I'm not great at protecting people from themselves. If you want to, I'm a great believer in John Stuart Mill on liberty. You want to whack yourself around, I'm probably not going to try and stop you. I may give you the information. But I do think we should protect vulnerable people from others, and that means a certain minimum level of economic activity. Not equality, obviously, but a minimum level. At any rate, I think that's valuable, but I also enjoy it. And that's the luckiest thing. Oh, and the third thing is I'm pretty good at it. There are some things in life at which I am terrible. The lucky thing for me is that I found a job which plays to my strengths, where my weaknesses don't count for much, and which I both enjoy and is morally relevant.
I read somewhere in some prep material before this interview that being Jewish had an influence on your approach to this whole thing.
Absolutely, and it's an encouraging thing in the sort of span of history. One of my favorite ways, given my opposition to discrimination and unfairness, one of my favorite ways at looking at American history, one of the most, I think, useful and morally relevant is look at the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Extraordinarily important statements of moral principle. Where it came from, you have to marvel. This was in an era, the 18th century, when people believed in kings and absolute religious theocracies. And these men, mostly in America, decided, no, we're going to have self-governance, etc., and people should be treated equally. Now, there was a disjunction between these wonderful principles and the application. They talked about all these universal principles, and then they applied to rich white Christian men. And one of the things that you've seen in American history is a series of movements in which the adjectives I've just talked about got peeled away. Mm-hmm. You didn't have to be rich. You didn't have to be white. You didn't have to be Christian. You didn't have to be a man. And more groups in this society have come to be able to participate fully. Now, it didn't happen, obviously, all at once. I wish in every case it had happened quicker. But I think it is relevant to note that it is happening. And I'm, as a gay man, very much involved, obviously, in the fight for gay and lesbian rights. I think that's one of the last battles that we are on the verge of winning. But 50 years ago, I graduated from high school in 1957. And I was thinking about a career. Now, I was interested in politics, but it never occurred to me that I could ever win an elected office. And people said, is that because you were gay? Well, I knew I was gay. I realized at 13 that I was gay. I realized that this notion that I chose it is, of course, one of the stupidest things, supposedly rational people ever said. I mean, I was 13 years old, and I was terrified to realize that I was gay. The notion that, oh boy, let me volunteer. Where do I sign up to be one of the most hated, despised minorities in America? Not what an average teenager does. But I was Jewish, and as I said, I figured I would deal with being gay by hiding it. But I had already outed myself with a bar mitzvah, so people knew I was Jewish. And I thought the fact that I was Jewish would keep me from winning elected office. There were a few places in the country, Brooklyn, a couple places in maybe Chicago, where there were enough Jews living in an area, so they elected other Jews. But in general, Jews didn't get elected to office. So from the time I graduated high school, went to college, I decided I was going to be an academic because I thought this was a career that would let me get involved with politics. I'd be a political scientist. I'd write about politics. I could work in campaigns. Maybe I'd be hired to work for somebody else for a little while. I had by the time I got to college, the motto of the Kennedy administration, where so many professors, Arthur Schlesinger and Kenneth Galbraith and McGeorge Bundy, Caucasian names may not mean much to people now in general, but they were academics who were put in important political positions. And that was my motto. I thought that I would be a professor, and I could immerse myself in politics as a profession, write about it, study about it, teach about it, and then from time to time participate.
Yeah. Does it surprise you? You mentioned being gay. Does it surprise you how much focus of whenever they write about you, that is in there, that's part of it? Well,
actually, it's gotten less so. That it's twofold. You're right. When people write about me personally, they do. Well, look, that's not surprising in American history.
But they don't mention you're Jewish. They mention you're gay.
Well, that's a very good point. And that's a sign of progress. 40 years ago, they would have mentioned that I was Jewish, I think. As I said, it would have been much more extraordinary if someone was black or was a woman, etc. Prejudices die out. Reality defeats prejudice. It takes a while, but it does. And the fact that I'm Jewish is not a big deal anymore. It was, for instance, in the New Deal under Roosevelt, I'm told by people who worked there, that Roosevelt started hiring people, and for a variety of reasons he found liberals who've been active in certain social movements. There were a lot of Jews. So they had some, they said they had two categories. They had Jews with Jewish names and Jews without Jewish names, because they wanted to kind of diminish the number of Jews there. There was a sensitivity to it. The New York Times, when I was growing up, if you had a very Jewish name, you had to use your initials. There was a great managing editor of the New York Times, A.H. Rosenthal. He was Abe. If your name was Abe in the New York Times, you had to use your initials, A.H. Raskin. Now, who they thought they were kidding with A.H. Rosenthal, wasn't what they think his first name was, Aloysius or Abercrombie, but Jewishness would have been more of an issue. The fact that people talk about my being gay and not about my being Jewish, I think, is a sign of progress in that anti-Semitism as a major phenomenon has died out. There are a few nuts out there. But when I was graduating high school, being Jewish was a career factor. There were law firms that didn't take Jews. Schools didn't take Jews. That's now disappeared. There are, I think, no barriers for Jews. Even Joe Lieberman was nominated for vice president, and it did not cause a problem. It would today for other reasons, legitimately. But the fact that I'm gay, lesbian, bisexual, and now transgender rights increasingly have come to the fore. So it is noteworthy. And I'm happy about that, because I'm a member of a group against which there is a great deal of prejudice. And I have, by a variety of factors, mostly luck, because you get to be chairman of a committee. Tip O'Neill, my good friend Ed Markey, congressman, told me, Tip O'Neill told him, you know, Eddie, we're in a funny business. We get ahead by the death, disgrace, or defeat of our friends. And that's how I got to be chairman, unfortunately, and not disgrace, but death and defeat. So I've achieved that position. The fact that I'm gay, I want people to know that, because there is still prejudice. And I want people to know that the prejudice is baseless. So if people see me doing the job, and if they like the job, then I want them to understand that this is, I don't want to be an exception. I want to be an example. You can't be an example if people don't know.
Okay, Ben, you're sitting here with me now, and it's so comfortable to talk about this. But when you made the decision to go public, what was that like for you?
Oh, I was very scared. And if you could, that's a perfectly good question. In fact, I didn't make the decision to go public until I was 47. Now, you know, how often in your life do you wait until you're 47 to do something like that? I realized I was gay when I was 13. I didn't tell anybody for a long time. And then I sort of dribbled it out. In the late 70s, I started telling people. I'd gotten elected to the state legislature. You know, I said before that I was lucky to go where my strengths counted, not my weaknesses. I was going to be a professor, as I said, but I have a character trait, which I'm not proud, but it's something I recognize, which is a disadvantage if you're trying to be a serious scholar, but it's almost a requirement if you want to be a legislator. I have a short attention span. I like to go from one thing to another. If I'm given 8 hours to think about one thing, I start to sharpen the pencils and find other things to do. As a legislator, I got to do a bunch of different things in a day. Professor, you got to sit there and think more. And at any rate, when I got involved in politics, helping out somebody, I said, yeah, I'm better at this than I would be an academic. So I ran for a state legislative seat. And at that point, I figured, well, okay, I'm not going to tell anybody I'm gay because I won't win. But after about 6 years in that job, I said, okay, here's the deal. I looked at the landscape, and there were no other seats I could win. It just didn't seem like I could get elected to something. And so I figured I would, at the end of the next legislative term, come out. I'd gone to law school. I had a law degree. I was then going to be a fairly effective, I think, gay rights advocate, because I would be openly gay. I would have served in the Massachusetts legislature. I'd be a lawyer. And then a thoroughly unexpected event made me a congressman. And it involved, I suppose what you would say was a very unlikely person, Pope John Paul II, because the man from the congressional district next to me was a Jesuit priest named Robert Trine, a great man. And he was too liberal, and the Pope didn't like this. So the Pope ordered him to leave politics. And he did, and I got to replace him. And I was in the process of telling people I was gay, and I said, oh, no, well, I'm not going to get elected to Congress. I may be a hell of a candidate, but I'm not good enough. In fact, I was not a great candidate, and I would have been a worse one if I'd been out. So I held back. I got elected to Congress in 1980. I had a tough race in 82 because there was a redistricting. I ran against a very able Republican woman who was undone by the recession and by the unpopularity of Reagan at that time in my district. So I got reelected, and I said, okay, now I can start thinking about coming out. It took me a few years, but finally in early 1987, I decided I'm tired of living this way. And so I was the first member of Congress, and I think probably the most prominent politician at that time, to voluntarily announce that I was gay, which I did.
Yeah. Did you find, right now in the country, and with economic woes and everything, a lot of people are putting a lot of blame on you because of your position in the chairmanship. And I wonder, do you get more negative reaction now because of what's going on with the economy and what is perceived to have happened, or did you get more when you came out as gay?
Well, I didn't get much when I came out as gay. What's happened now is I've become more prominent, so the right wing has decided that, look, they have this problem. The lack of regulation that the right wing held to, as Alan Greenspan admitted he made a mistake, they understand that that's overwhelmingly the cause of our current problems. And they don't want to see regulation. So they've looked at ways to blame others. In fact, I have a fairly easy time when people raise it. I became chairman of the committee in 2007. Now, the problem politically was that by 2008, when the Bush administration asked for this money, Chris Dodd, Senator Dodd, and I became very prominent. But in fact, we were in the minority before that. So I've had Republicans say, why didn't you do regulations? Well, I wasn't the chairman of the committee. I was in favor of regulation, and they were not. When we became the majority in 2007, we did a lot of things. So, but the reason that I have gotten a lot of the criticism, Speaker Pelosi also, Senator Dodd, the right wing is understandably frightened that we're going to see regulation of credit default swaps and of collateralized derivatives and of a whole range of things that had been left unregulated. Their philosophy has always been, if you leave capital alone, don't tax it, don't regulate it, don't restrict its international freedom of movement, it'll take care of everybody. The economic collapse now is really a repudiation by reality of their philosophy. And no one thinks it was caused by events of 2007. That's when they were in the majority. I mean, the Republicans controlled the Congress from 1995 to 2006. So they're trying to scapegoat some of the rest of us for avoiding the blame, but it's not working.
Was it something we could have stopped? Or
yes.
Did it have to go up so high to come down?
It could have stopped. Alan Greenspan, to his credit, has acknowledged this. In 1994, Congress passed a bill that said to the Federal Reserve, regulate subprime mortgages. Let's go back a little before. Mortgages, and bad mortgages were at the root of this. 30 years ago and more, mortgages were granted by banks, which were tightly regulated. And then a whole lot of change came into place. And mortgages have been granted for much of the past 30 years, they've stopped now, by non-banks that weren't regulated, and they use something called securitization. 30 years ago, if you got a mortgage from a bank, and you had to repay that bank, and the bank was very careful not to give you the money unless they thought you could pay them back. But then we got securitization. People started to get loans from people who were then going to sell the right to be paid back. And if I am waiting for you to pay me back, I'm going to be more careful, it turns out, than if I sell the right to be paid back by you to a whole lot of other people.
Now, as I understand, there were regulations that were proposed, and you were a proponent of that until the vote came on the floor and you voted against it. What a lot of people don't realize is what you voted against was all that was added to it and changed.
Oh, this is on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac,
yeah.
Correct.
So why is this allowed to happen in our government?
Well, in 2005, I did support a bill to regulate Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. By the way, the bill passed anyway, so they can't blame me for stopping it. What happened was the Republican committee chairman who passed the bill blamed the Bush administration. It was an intra-Republican fight. But here's what they did. We said, let's regulate Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and let's take some of their profits and put it into rental housing. That was another major fight I had with the Republicans. They thought the best way to help low-income people was to help them own homes. Frankly, I don't think you're doing someone a favor when you put him or her into owning a home that he or she can't afford, can't manage, can't organize. I wanted to build rental housing. They wanted to put them into home ownership. I was critical of that. We lost out. They were in the majority. We did in 2005 say, instead of putting people in homes that they can't own, that are going to go under, let's build decent rental housing. we had provisions in there to do that. When the bill came to the floor, Tom DeLay, again, let me give credit to a Houston politician, we're here in Houston, said, oh, no, we don't want any of this. And he amended the bill, the Republican leadership did, to restrict the provision that allowed for building rental housing. He said he had to stop these left-wing groups from going well. Among the groups that was very opposed to this and said it would interfere with the housing problem was the Catholic Church, so not exactly a leftist group. When that passed, that restricted the housing, I did vote against the bill, but the bill passed. So that was hardly the objection that kept it. That was in 2005. It then went to the Senate, and the Republicans in the Senate fought with the Republicans in the House and wouldn't bring the bill up. The Republican Secretary of the Treasury, John Snow at the time, said this is a good bill. The right-wingers in the White House said it wasn't. At any rate, the answer was that was when they were in power. 2006, we win the election. 2007, we're in power. And I, as chairman of the committee, was able to get a bill passed that did both the rental housing and the tough regulation. But you're right, it was and even then, by the way, after they defeated it, I was hoping the Senate would still, after they tripled the housing part, that the Senate would pass it.
Barney Frank, thank you so much for sitting down with us.
To order a DVD of this or any episode of Interviews, please visit HoustonPBS.org.